Every civilization that ever existed had a god of thunder, but only one of them built the entire Western world around his name and then quietly removed the most important parts of his story before anyone could ask too many questions. This is not the Zeus you were taught. The Zeus you were taught was sanitized, simplified, and stripped of everything that made the original tradition dangerous. The original tradition said he almost lost, that he was overthrown once and nearly overthrown twice more, that there was a version of him so powerful that the other gods destroyed every text that mentioned it, and that the prophecy about his own fall was known to every Greek philosopher and mentioned by none of them in public. This is the forbidden version, and it has been waiting in the primary sources the entire time.
The real Zeus, the forbidden version of the thunder god.
There is a temple in Olympia, Greece, that once contained a statue so large that the seated figure's head nearly touched the ceiling 40 meters above the floor. The statue was made of gold and ivory. It depicted Zeus, and it was considered by every ancient writer who saw it to be one of the most overwhelming objects a human being could stand in front of. The statue no longer exists. The temple is ruins, but the texts that described what Zeus actually was, before the poets simplified him, before the philosophers rationalized him, before the Roman Empire absorbed him and filed the dangerous edges smooth, those texts survived. This video is built from those texts, not the Zeus of Hollywood, not the Zeus of popular mythology books, not the Zeus who throws lightning bolts at people who annoy him. That Zeus is real. He exists in the sources, but he is approximately 1/10 of what the original tradition actually preserved. The other 9/10 is what this video is about. We will cover 5 specific aspects of the Zeus tradition that the popular version either omits entirely or deliberately misrepresents. Every claim comes from a named primary source you can read yourself. Nothing will be exaggerated. Where the ancient sources agree, we will say so. Where they contradict each other, we will tell you exactly how and why. This is the real Zeus, the one the ancient Greeks actually believed in before the version designed for export replaced the version designed for truth. We begin before Olympus, before Greece, before the name Zeus meant what it means now. We begin with a storm god so old that his name appears in languages that predate the Greek alphabet by 2,000 years. And the fact that his name appears there at all is the first thing the popular version forgot to mention.
Before Olympus, the Indo-European thunder god.
The name Zeus is not Greek. This is the fact that changes everything about how the tradition should be read, and it is the fact that popular mythology almost never mentions the name Zeus derives from the Proto-Indo-European root dias, meaning the bright sky. The divine sky, and it appears in cognate forms across every major Indo-European language, Dios Pita in Sanskrit, documented in the Rig Veda at sacred-texts.com, Jupiter in Latin, a direct contraction of Dies Pater, Skyfather, Ter in Norse, appearing in the Poetic Edda at sacred-texts.com, Dievas in Lithuanian, still present in folk tradition into the modern era. The deity the Greeks called Zeus was not invented in Greece, he was inherited. The Greeks arrived in the Aegean as part of the Indo-European migration between roughly 4000 and 1000 BC, bringing with them a fully developed skyfather whose essential characteristics, sovereignty, thunder, the enforcement of oaths, punishment of those who violated divine order, were already ancient when the Greeks arrived. Martin Litchfield West documents this in Indo-European Poetry and Myth, published by Oxford University Press, the most comprehensive modern study of the shared mythological inheritance of the Indo-European peoples. West demonstrates that the core attributes of Zeus, his association with the oak tree, his role as enforcer of oaths, his epithet as father of gods and men, his weapon of thunder, all predate the Greek tradition and appear in cognate forms across the Indo-European world. This matters for one specific reason. When the Greeks encountered the pre-existing religious traditions of the Aegean, the Minoan tradition of Crete, the Mycenaean tradition that preceded classical Greece, they did not invent Zeus as a response to those traditions. They brought Zeus with them and then merged him with what they found. What they found in Crete was particularly significant. The Minoan tradition, documented through excavations at Knossos and Phaistos, analyzed in Arthur Evans's The Palace of Minos at archive.org, included a young male deity associated with the bull with death and resurrection, and with a sacred cave on Mount Ida where divine birth was understood to occur. The Greeks said that cave was where Zeus was born, absorbing the Cretan tradition into the Zeus mythology by making the Cretan deity a phase of Zeus's own biography. The result was a Zeus with two completely different origin stories existing simultaneously in the tradition. The Indo-European skyfather who was always eternal and always sovereign, and the Cretan cave deity who was born hidden, threatened, and had to fight for everything he eventually held. Popular mythology chose the first story and forgot the second. The primary sources preserved both, and the second story, the one about the cave, the hiding, the threat, is the one that explains everything else in this video.
The child who lived, what was taken of?
The version of Zeus's birth most people know comes from Hesiod's Theogony. Cronus, after overthrowing his father Uranus, receives a prophecy that one of his children will overthrow him. His response is systematic. He swallows each child as Rhea gives birth. Ischia, Demeter, Ida Hades, Poseidon, all swallowed. When Zeus is born, Rhea substitutes a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. Cronus swallows the stone. Zeus grows up in secret in Crete, returns, forces Cronus to release his siblings, leads the Olympians in the Titanomachy wins, and establishes the current divine order. What the popular tradition does is stop here, as if this were the whole story. The Orphic tradition, documented in fragments collected in West's The Orphic Poems published by Oxford University Press, preserves a significantly different version, different enough that ancient writers treated the Orphic and Hesiodic traditions as separate theologies rather than variants of the same story. In the Orphic version, the stone substitution does not appear. Rhea hides the infant Zeus in a cave guarded by the curates, divine attendants, who clash their shields together whenever the infant cries to prevent Cronus from hearing him. Their shield-clashing ritual was actively performed in historical times at Cretan sanctuaries. Ritual performance of mythological events typically indicates mythology of considerable antiquity. It means the tradition was old enough and important enough that communities maintained physical enactment of it across generations. But the most significant difference is what happens after Zeus grows to maturity. In Hesiod, Zeus goes directly from his hiding place to his confrontation with Cronus. In the Orphic tradition, there is an intermediate phase that Hesiod omits entirely. In the Orphic version, Zeus descends, he goes into the underworld, he confronts powers there, and he comes back changed, described with language the Orphic tradition normally reserves for initiatory experience. The transformation that mystery cult initiates underwent when passing through ritual death and rebirth, Walter Burkert analyzes this in Ancient Mystery Cults published by Harvard University Press. He argues the Orphic version preserves a pre-Greek initiatory mythology in which the supreme deity himself underwent death and resurrection, the same experience that human initiates later reenacted in the mystery cults. The implication is significant. The Zeus who emerges from the Orphic tradition has experienced something the Hesiodic Zeus has not. And what he experienced is precisely what the popular version removed when it simplified the birth narrative to the stone substitution story. What was removed was a Zeus who died, or underwent something close enough to death that the tradition preserved the memory of it in the language of initiation. A Zeus who had to go into the dark before he could come into the light. A Zeus for whom sovereignty was not simply won in battle, but earned through an experience the Hesiodic tradition found too complex to preserve. The stone is easier to tell. The descent is harder to explain. The popular tradition chose the stone. The Orphic tradition kept the descent. And what the Orphic tradition kept changes the nature of Zeus in ways the popular version has never fully recovered.
The wars no one talks about.
Most people who know Greek mythology know about the Titanomachy, the 10-year war between the Olympians and the Titans that established Zeus's supremacy. What most people do not know is that the Titanomachy was the first of 3 wars, and the second and third, the Gigantomachy and the Typhonomachy, are more theologically significant than the first. because in both of them, Zeus came significantly closer to losing. The Gigantomachy is documented most comprehensively in Timothy Gantz's Early Greek Myth, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. The giants were children of Gaia, born from the blood of the castrated Uranus, siblings of the Titans, and, genealogically, the aunts and uncles of the Olympians. What makes the Gigantomachy theologically significant is the prophecy that preceded it. According to Apollodorus in his library at sacred-texts.com, the giants could not be killed by gods alone. A mortal had to participate in their defeat. This is why Heracles appears in the Gigantomachy, fighting alongside the Olympians. The gods needed a human being to win their own war. A divine order that cannot defend itself without mortal assistance is a divine order with a structural vulnerability. The popular tradition treats Heracles' participation as a colorful detail. It is a theologically troubling admission that the popular version has never fully processed. The Typhonomachy, the war between Zeus and Typhon, is the most extreme case of divine vulnerability in the entire Greek tradition, and the one the popular version most consistently underplays. Typhon was the last child of Gaia, born after the defeat of the giants as Gaia's final attempt to overthrow the Olympian order. Hesiod describes him in the Theogony as the most powerful creature ever born with 100 serpent heads, a voice that contained every animal sound simultaneously, and strength that exceeded everything the Olympians had previously faced. What Hesiod's version does not fully preserve, but the Homeric hymns and Apollodorus do, is that Zeus lost the first encounter. Typhon successfully seized Zeus, cut the sinews from his hands and feet, and left him immobilized in a cave in Cilicia while Typhon hid the sinews. Zeus was rescued by Hermes and Pan. His sinews were restored. He then re-engaged Typhon and ultimately defeated him by burying him under Mount Etna. This is not a minor variant. This is the supreme deity of the Greek tradition captured, mutilated, and temporarily overthrown by a monster. The primary sources are explicit. Zeus lost the first round. He needed help to recover. The popular version either omits this entirely or reduces it to a brief obstacle that Zeus overcomes without difficulty. The three wars together tell a story about divine sovereignty that is much more complicated than the popular tradition acknowledges. Sovereignty was won, lost, nearly lost again. Won again with outside help, and maintained against challenges from within the divine family as much as from outside it. The Zeus who presides over the Olympian order at the beginning of Homer's Iliad has survived 3 wars, 1 temporary defeat, 1 near-permanent overthrow, and at least 2 prophecies about his own future fall. Homer's weariness is not a character flaw. It is the accumulated weight of everything that happened before Troy that Homer's audience already knew, and that the popular tradition forgot to preserve.
The affairs that were not affairs.
The most commonly known aspect of Zeus in popular mythology is his pattern of unions with mortal women Alcmene, Leda, Danae, Io, Europa, Semele, which produced the heroes and demigods who populate the mythological tradition. In popular culture, these are presented as straightforward divine infidelity, with Zeus pursuing mortal women for reasons requiring no more theological explanation than basic desire. The primary sources tell a more complicated and more interesting story. Ken Dowden in Zeus, published by Routledge, documents how these unions functioned as political and religious legitimization narratives for the Greek city-states. Every major Greek city that claimed divine ancestry traced it to a union between Zeus and a local woman. Argos claimed descent from Io Thebes, from Semele, Sparta from Leda, Crete from Europa. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute a theological system, not a collection of individual stories. What the system was doing was providing divine authorization for local political structures. A city whose founding family could claim Zeus as ancestor was a city whose political legitimacy was grounded in the divine order itself. The union between Zeus and the local woman was not a story about desire. It was a claim about sovereignty, about the right of a particular lineage to rule a particular place. Because that lineage was connected by blood to the god who enforced divine order across the cosmos, this is why the unions follow a consistent pattern. Zeus appears in disguise or in animal form as a bull for Europa, a swan for Leda, a shower of gold for Danae, a cloud for Io. The disguise is not concealment from Hera, as the popular tradition frames it. In the earlier versions of these myths, documented by Dowden and by Walter Burkhardt in Structure and History in Greek, Mythology and Ritual published by University of California Press, the transformation is a theophany, a divine manifestation communicating specific attributes. Zeus as bull communicates fertility and sovereignty over the earth. Zeus as swan communicates the boundary between divine and mortal worlds. Zeus as shower of gold communicates the descent of divine power from the sky. The women in these stories were not passive recipients of divine attention. In the earliest versions, they are typically priestesses, or figures associated with specific sanctuaries, or women whose names derive from place names and deity names that predate the Zeus tradition. Io's name cognates with the moon in pre-Greek traditions. Europa appears as a divine epithet before it appears as a mortal name. Semele's name is cognate with the Thracian earth goddess. Semele, who is a deity in her own right before the Zeus mythology, absorbed her as the mother of Dionysus. What the popular version preserved was the narrative surface, the pursuits, the transformations, the offspring. What it lost was the theological structure beneath the system by which the Greek cities legitimized their political orders through divine genealogy, and the evidence that many of Zeus's mortal lovers were not mortals at all, but pre-existing deities absorbed into the Zeus mythology as the Greek tradition expanded across the Aegean.
The end of Zeus and the Unmentioned prophecy.
The Zeus of the popular tradition is eternal and unquestioned. The Zeus of the primary sources is a deity under a prophecy of his own potential overthrow that hangs over the entire tradition and is explicitly mentioned in multiple sources while being almost completely absent from popular mythology. The prophecy concerns Thetis, the sea nymph, who becomes the mother of Achilles, according to Pinder's Isthmian Odes at Sig.com and Aeschylus's lost play Prometheus Unbound reconstructed from fragments. Thetis was pursued by both Zeus and Poseidon, a prophecy attributed in different sources to Prometheus, to Themis, and to the Fates, stated that the son of Thetis would be more powerful than his father. Zeus and Poseidon, upon learning of this prophecy, immediately abandoned their pursuit and arranged for Thetis to marry the mortal Peleus so that her son would be mortal rather than a divine being more powerful than the ruling gods. The mortal son is Achilles. The plan worked. Achilles was mortal, died at Troy, and posed no threat to divine sovereignty. But the existence of the plan reveals something the popular tradition consistently ignores. Zeus's sovereignty is not secure. It is maintained in part through careful management of reproductive politics, through ensuring that the being who could overthrow him is never born as a divine being. The same structural vulnerability that made Cronus swallow his children is present in Zeus's own reign. He has simply found a more sophisticated solution than swallowing. The Prometheus tradition makes this explicit. In Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, available through Project Gutenberg, Prometheus, chained to his rock as punishment for giving fire to humanity, repeatedly hints that he knows a secret about Zeus's potential fall that Zeus does not know. The secret is the Thetis prophecy. Prometheus will only reveal it in exchange for his freedom. The play ends without resolution. Aeschylus wrote 2 sequels, both lost. But the theological structure of Prometheus Bound is clear. Zeus is not omniscient. There is information about his own future that he does not possess and that he needs from a being he has imprisoned and tortured. This Zeus, the one who does not know his own prophecy, who manages his potential overthrow through political maneuvering rather than absolute power, who needs information from his enemies to secure his own sovereignty, is theologically continuous with the Zeus who hid in a Cretan cave, who was mutilated by Typhon, who needed a mortal hero to win the Gigantomachy, and who destroyed and rebuilt humanity without solving the underlying problem that made the destruction necessary. The popular tradition presents Zeus as the answer to all cosmic questions. The primary sources present him as a being who is still working out the answers and who knows, because the tradition of prophecy is explicit about it, that the answers he finds may not be sufficient forever. The Stoic philosophers, who read the primary sources carefully, developed a theology of ekpyrosis, the periodic destruction and renewal of the cosmos through fire, that some scholars read as a rationalized version of the mythological tradition of Zeus's potential fall and replacement. If Zeus is the current cosmic order, then the end of Zeus is the end of the current cosmos and the beginning of the next one. The primary sources do not say this explicitly, but the structure they preserve, a supreme deity under prophecy, managing his own potential overthrow through political intelligence rather than absolute power, is consistent with a tradition that understood divine sovereignty as cyclical rather than eternal.
At the end, this is the real Zeus.
5 aspects of the Zeus tradition, 5 things the popular version either forgot or chose not to preserve, and in each case, what was lost was not peripheral detail but structural theology. The parts of the tradition that explained why Zeus was the way he was, what it cost him to become what he became, and what the Greeks who worshipped him actually believed about the nature of divine power. The Indo-European Skyfather, whose name appears in Sanskrit and Lithuanian and Norse before it appears in Greek. A deity inherited rather than invented, older than the civilization that made him famous. The Orphic deity who underwent something close to death before he won anything. A Zeus who had to go into the dark before he could come into the light. The god who lost his first encounter with Typhon, who needed a mortal hero to win the Gigant Tamachi, whose sovereignty was won and nearly lost and won again with outside help across 3 separate wars. The divine administrator whose unions with mortal women were a system of political legitimization rather than a pattern of infidelity, and whose mortal lovers were, in many cases, not mortals at all. And the sovereign under prophecy who manages his own potential, overthrow through intelligence rather than absolute power, who does not know his own future, who needs information from his enemies to stay in power, and who the primary sources present not as the answer to all cosmic questions, but as a being still working out the answers. These are not separate stories about a character named Zeus. They are facets of a single tradition that the Greeks spent 3,000 years developing and that the popular version compressed into a figure, simple enough for a mythology book written for children or a film written for a general audience. The primary sources are still there. The Theogony, the Orphic fragments, the Derveni Papyrus, the Isthmian odes, Prometheus bound, they have been waiting the entire time for the version of Zeus that lives in them to be read carefully enough to come back into focus. That version is more complicated than the popular one. It is also more honest, and it is, in every way that matters, more interesting. If you like the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and follow for more.